It is a Tuesday afternoon in a dental office in Lagos, Nigeria, and a 19-year-old woman is asking a question that would sound absurd almost anywhere else on the planet. She is not asking the dentist to close the small space between her two front teeth. She's asking him to make it wider. The dentist has heard the request before. He knows the risks, the chronic jaw ache some patients report afterward, the strain on the surrounding bone, and still he books the appointment because in the culture she grew up in, that gap is not a flaw, it is currency. It is a mark of beauty so prized that some women pay to acquire one they were never born with. The dentist himself has no gap in his own smile, closed years earlier by his own parents when he was still a teenager, and he still feels a small flicker of irony every time a patient asks him to do the exact reverse of what was once done to him. Now travel 8,000 kilometers north and west into an orthodontist's office in London or New York, and you will find the opposite emergency playing out in real time. A parent sits across from the dentist visibly anxious, pointing at their child's new adult teeth, insisting something be done immediately before the smile sets that way for life. Same feature. Same 1 millimeter to 3 millimeter space between the same two teeth. Two completely opposite reactions, split by nothing more than geography and inherited assumption. For decades, nobody could explain why a single physical trait could be treated as a defect on one continent and a prize on another, and more importantly, nobody could explain where the trait actually came from in the first place. The old answers, thumb-sucking, tongue-pushing, a bad childhood habit, felt sturdy enough until you looked closely at family photographs spanning 3 or 4 generations and noticed the same gap resurfacing again and again in people who never sucked a thumb in their life. Something deeper was clearly at work, something written into the body before habit ever had a chance to act on it. And when geneticists finally went looking for that deeper cause, what they found did not just answer the question. It rewrote the entire story of what a gapped smile actually is, tracing it back through named genes, a 4-figure timeline of human evolution, and an inheritance pattern strong enough to behave like a genetic signature stamped onto a face. Start with the terminology, because it matters more than it sounds like it should. Dentists call this space a diastema, borrowed from a Greek word meaning an interval, a gap between two things. Technically, any visible space between any two teeth in the mouth qualifies as a diastema. But when people picture the trait, they are almost always picturing one very specific version of it, the space that sits directly between the two upper front teeth, formerly called a maxillary midline diastema. It is one of the most common dental features on the planet. It appears constantly in young children, so constantly that pediatric dentists have a name for the developmental window where the vast majority of kids will show one at some point. Depending on which population you study, somewhere between roughly 2 and 25% of adults retain a visible gap after their permanent teeth fully erupt, with the trait appearing noticeably more often in populations of African descent than in European or East Asian populations. That single statistic, buried in dental journals for decades, turns out to be one of the biggest clues to where the whole story eventually leads. For most of the 20th century, the explanation offered to worried parents was mechanical and behavioral. A gap was blamed on thumb-sucking, on a pacifier left in a child's mouth too long, on a tongue that pressed forward against the front teeth during swallowing, a habit dentists call a tongue thrust. None of these explanations were invented out of thin air. They were, and still are, partially true. A thumb held against the front teeth for years genuinely can push them apart. A tongue that presses forward with every swallow genuinely can widen a space over time. The problem was never that these explanations were wrong. The problem was that they were right just often enough to feel like the entire answer, which meant the deeper cause sat quietly unexamined for generations, because the habit theory could not explain the one pattern that kept showing up no matter how hard researchers tried to make it disappear. It could not explain why the exact same gap, same width, same location, kept reappearing across grandmother, mother, and daughter in households where nobody had ever sucked a thumb past infancy. It could not explain families where 3 siblings raised in identical conditions, same house, same habits, same dentist, ended up with wildly different outcomes. One child with no gap at all, one with a hairline space, one with a wide and obvious diastema. Environment alone could not account for that kind of variation. Something was traveling through the bloodline itself. Researchers eventually decided to test that suspicion directly, and testing it properly required a very specific kind of study. To separate genuine inheritance from shared environment, you need extended families, multiple generations, siblings, cousins, grandparents, and you need to measure how closely relatives resemble each other compared to how closely you would expect 2 random strangers to resemble each other. In 2003, a research team based at Case Western Reserve University did exactly this, using pedigree data pulled from 30 extended families to calculate the heritability of the maxillary midline diastema, publishing their results in the American Journal of Orthodontics and Dentofacial Orthopedics. Using specialized genetic epidemiology software, they arrived at a heritability estimate of roughly 0. 32 in the sample of families with European ancestry, meaning close to a third of the variation in who develops the gap and who does not, traces back to inherited genetic factors rather than chance or habit. Just as significant, the pattern of inheritance they observed in those family trees was consistent with what geneticists call an autosomal dominant trait, the kind of inheritance where a feature can be passed directly from parent to child across generation after generation without skipping and without needing 2 copies of a gene to show up. Sit with what that number actually implies. Nearly a third of whether you end up with that space in your smile was decided before you were born, encoded in the same bloodline that gave you your eye color or the shape of your nose. But a heritability number, however striking, is a strange kind of evidence. It can prove that something is inherited without ever explaining what exactly is being passed down or how it physically builds the trait in question. The Case-Western number settled an argument. It could not by itself name the machinery. And the machinery, once researchers went looking for it, turned out to be sitting in plain sight, buried in the simple arithmetic of how a human mouth is physically assembled. Here is that arithmetic, and it is almost disappointingly simple once you see it laid out. There is no single defect gene that causes a gap. There is no malfunction. A mouth is built from 2 separate measurements that have to line up correctly for a smile to close cleanly. The first measurement is the size of the dental arch, the curved ridge of jawbone the teeth are actually planted into. The second measurement is the collective width of the teeth themselves as they erupt and settle into that arch. When those 2 measurements are proportional, the teeth touch their neighbors edge to edge and the smile closes with no visible spaces. When they are not proportional, you get one of exactly 2 outcomes. If the teeth are collectively too large for the available arch, they crowd, overlap, and rotate looking for room, the crooked smile pattern most people associate with needing braces. If the teeth are collectively too small for the available arch, the opposite happens. There is simply more bone than there is tooth to fill it, and the leftover space has to go somewhere. It opens up as a visible gap, most often right at the midline between the 2 front teeth, because that is typically the last seam to close during eruption. The part of this story that actually solves the mystery is that both of those measurements, jaw size and tooth size, are independently heritable, meaning they are controlled by different sets of instructions in your DNA and can be inherited from entirely different branches of your family tree. You can inherit a wide, roomy dental arch from your father's side and a set of comparatively narrow, small front teeth from your mother's side, and neither trait on its own is any kind of flaw. A generously sized jaw is not a defect. Small incisors are not a defect. But when those 2 independently normal inheritances land together in a single face, the mismatch is not an accident at all. It is close to a mathematical certainty. 2 ordinary traits, from 2 different lineages intersecting in one mouth and leaving a measurable gap behind as the residue. This single insight explains everything the old habit theory never could. It explains why the trait runs in families, because both of its ingredients run in families. It explains why siblings raised identically can show completely different gap patterns, because each child inherits a slightly different combination of arch size and tooth size from the shared gene pool of their parents. And it explains why the trait behaves like a dominant genetic inheritance in family studies, because in a very real sense, it is exactly that. 2 separate inheritances converging in the same skeleton. Once researchers understood the arithmetic, the obvious next question became which genes are actually setting those 2 measurements in the first place. This is where the story moves out of family trees and into molecular biology, and where 2 gene names come up again and again in the scientific literature. The first is MSX1, a gene located on chromosome 4 that functions as one of the master regulators of tooth development, one of the earliest molecular switches that tells developing tissue where to build a tooth, when to build it, and how large to make it. The second is PAX9, a closely related regulator gene that works in direct partnership with MSX1 throughout the entire process. Research on both mice and humans has repeatedly shown that these 2 genes interact directly during tooth formation, and disruptions, or natural variations, in either one have been linked not only to teeth that fail to form at all, a condition called tooth agenesis, but also to changes in the ultimate size of the teeth that do form. And tooth size, as the arithmetic above makes clear, is exactly half of the equation that produces a gap. Laboratory studies on mice have shown that when both genes are knocked out simultaneously, tooth development can stall completely at an early embryonic stage, underscoring just how central this genetic partnership really is to building a functional set of teeth. MSX1 and PAX9 are not acting alone in a vacuum. As the genetics of dental development has deepened over the last 2 decades, researchers have identified a growing network of more than 100 additional genes, including axin2, WNT10A, and several members of the transforming growth factor family, all involved in controlling the number, position, size, and shape of human teeth. Some of these genes are shared with entirely different developmental systems elsewhere in the body, which is part of why researchers studying tooth agenesis sometimes find unrelated conditions clustering in the same families. A reminder that the genetic program building a mouth is deeply interconnected with the rest of human development rather than isolated to teeth alone. A diastema, in other words, is not sitting on one single genetic switch. It emerges from an entire developmental program, and the small, perfectly normal variations scattered across that program are what quietly nudge a given mouth towards smaller front teeth, a roomier arch, and the space that opens up between them. Before going further, there is an honest complication worth addressing directly, because leaving it out would make the story cleaner than the evidence actually allows. Not every visible gap is purely the result of inherited tooth size meeting inherited jaw size. There is a second, entirely separate mechanism that sits right behind the most common version of this trait, the space between the two upper front teeth specifically. If you lift your upper lip and look at the midline, you will notice a thin band of tissue running from the inside of the lip down toward the gum between the front teeth. Dentists call this the labial frenum. In most people, it attaches high up and stays completely out of the way of the teeth. In some people, however, it is unusually thick or attaches low, reaching down between the two front teeth and inserting directly into the gum at the exact point those teeth would otherwise meet. When the frenum sits in that position, it physically acts like a wedge, holding the front teeth apart and keeping a space open that might otherwise have closed naturally as the child grew. This is precisely why a dentist examining a child's gap will check the frenum first, and why a minor surgical procedure to release it, called a frenectomy, is sometimes performed as part of closing a stubborn diastema that will not respond to orthodontic treatment alone. So the honest picture is that this trait is what researchers call multifactorial, a term used specifically because no single cause explains every case. A person can inherit a naturally wide arch and naturally small front teeth, and on top of that, also have a low attaching frenum, and perhaps a childhood tongue thrust habit layered on top of all of it. Stack enough of those factors together in one person, and the resulting gap becomes what scientists sometimes describe as overdetermined, arriving by several independent roads at once rather than any single cause. This nuance actually mirrors something genetics teaches us again and again about human traits generally. DNA rarely hands you a single guaranteed outcome. It hands you a range, a tendency, a starting hand, that development and tissue and habit then finish filling in. The old assumptions about thumb-sucking and tongue habits were never entirely fabricated. They were simply incomplete, mistaken about which factor sat at the true foundation of the trait, rather than acting as a minor amplifier, layered on top of it. Understanding the frenum and the arithmetic of arch versus tooth size still leaves one much larger question completely unanswered. And it is the question that reframes this entire trait on a species-wide scale. If jaw size and tooth size are both inherited, why do human jaws so reliably end up larger than the teeth meant to fill them in the first place? Why is this mismatch so common across huge swaths of the human population, rather than being some rare genetic accident? The answer to that question does not live in any single family's genome. It lives in roughly the last 12,000 years of how the entire human species has eaten. For nearly the whole existence of our species, human ancestors ate the way every wild animal eats: raw and minimally processed food, tough roots, fibrous plants, unprocessed meat, food that had to be torn, ground, and chewed extensively before it could ever be swallowed. That kind of demanding diet requires a genuinely powerful chewing apparatus. And over hundreds of thousands of years, the human body built exactly that: large and robust jaws with heavy supporting musculature and plenty of room for a full, large set of teeth. Jaw size and tooth size grew up together in rough proportion across that enormous stretch of time, because the same physically demanding diet that built and stressed the jaw also justified keeping the teeth large. Then, starting roughly 12,000 years ago, agriculture arrived, and with it came grinding grain, cooking food over fire, and the gradual, steady softening of nearly everything humans put into their mouths. Cooked food instead of raw, ground grain instead of tough root, soft instead of fibrous, and the jaw, no longer subjected to the intense mechanical stress it had evolved under for millions of years, began to physically respond to that reduced demand within just a handful of generations. Skeletal studies comparing populations before and after the agricultural transition show this shift directly in the bones themselves. Jaw size measurably decreased across post-agricultural populations. Tooth size, however, did not shrink at anywhere near the same pace, and that mismatch in timing is the crucial detail. Tooth size is set tightly by the developmental genetic program built around MSX1, PAX9, and their supporting network, and that program changes extremely slowly across generations. Jaw size, by contrast, is far more sensitive to diet, to chewing stress, and to mechanical loading during a child's early growth years, and it can shift comparatively quickly in response to environmental change. The result is essentially a body running on outdated arithmetic. Large numbers of people inherited a jaw shaped by the modern, softer food environment while still carrying tooth size genetics closer to the older, harder food world. And the leftover space between the two measurements opens up as a visible gap. Researchers have a specific name for this kind of lag, where a body is still built for conditions that no longer exist around it. They call it evolutionary mismatch, and it shows up across many different parts of human anatomy, not just the mouth. Wisdom teeth becoming impacted because modern jaws are too small to fit a full ancestral set of molars is widely considered another expression of this exact same underlying mismatch, which is part of why removing wisdom teeth has become such a routine part of modern dental care in populations eating a largely industrialized, processed diet, while it was rarely necessary for ancestors chewing tougher, coarser food for most of their lives. In that light, the gap at the front of the mouth and the impacted molar at the back of the mouth are really two symptoms of the exact same underlying story, a jaw that changed shape faster than the genetic program controlling tooth size ever could. Seen through that lens, the gap in a modern smile functions almost like a fossil, a visible physical trace of a 12,000-year-old shift in human diet recorded permanently in a single face. Not a flaw, but a signature, the mark of a species whose jaw evolved faster than its teeth did, written directly into the mouths of people walking around today. And once you understand the gap as that kind of deep, shared ancient inheritance, it becomes far easier to understand why so many cultures across human history, long before anyone had ever heard of MSX1 or heritability studies, looked at exactly this trait and saw something worth celebrating rather than correcting. Travel to West Africa today and the gap is treated less like an accident and more like a prize. Among Yoruba-speaking communities in southwestern Nigeria, the trait even carries its own affectionate name, Eji, and is widely regarded as a mark of beauty and even wealth, particularly celebrated in women. A study conducted among Yoruba-speaking students at the University of Ilorin found the natural gap occurring in a little over a quarter of the population sampled, and separate research into attitudes toward the trait found that roughly 1 in 3 participants in some samples had actually undergone a cosmetic procedure specifically to create a diastema they were not naturally born with, precisely the reverse of the orthodontic instinct common in Western dental practice. Physicians in the region have noted that some patients pursue this despite dentists' warning of chronic jaw discomfort as a possible side effect, a striking sign of just how strongly the beauty ideal outweighs the physical inconvenience for many who want it. Read that twice because it is worth sitting with. In parts of Nigeria, people visit a dentist not to close a gap, but specifically to open one that nature did not give them. The same physical feature that one culture routinely sends a child to an orthodontist to eliminate, another culture treats as a trait worth deliberately acquiring. This is not limited to West Africa either. Historical and cultural accounts describe the gap between the front teeth being associated with beauty, luck, or fertility in a range of older societies, stretching from ancient Egypt through parts of medieval European folklore, where the feature was sometimes read as a sign of a bold, restless, or adventurous nature. The specific interpretations shift from place to place and era to era, but the underlying pattern is strikingly consistent. Across continents and centuries, people repeatedly looked at the exact same small physical space and reached for words like beauty, fortune, and distinction, long before anyone possessed the scientific tools to explain why the trait existed or where it actually came from. What makes that pattern quietly remarkable is that none of those older cultures had access to heritability studies. Nobody centuries ago in Nigeria or ancient Egypt had ever heard of MSX1 or PAX9, and nobody understood the underlying arithmetic of shrinking jaws outpacing static tooth size, and yet they intuited, purely through generations of lived observation, the exact thing modern genetics would eventually confirm in a laboratory, that this trait was never damage, never an accident, never a childhood habit gone unchecked, but a natural and consistently inherited part of the human face, traveling down specific bloodlines and worth noticing, worth naming, and in many places worth actively preserving. The modern Western impulse to immediately correct the trait with braces or veneers is, viewed against this much longer historical backdrop, closer to a recent exception than it is to any kind of universal rule. For the overwhelming majority of human history, in the overwhelming majority of human societies, that small space was simply understood as one of the many ways a face could be genuinely beautiful. So the next time you or someone you know catches a reflection and notices that small space sitting right at the front of a smile, understand exactly what is actually being looked at. It is not a flaw, it is not an accident, and it is not evidence of some forgotten childhood habit that should have been corrected sooner. What is being looked at is the meeting point of two separate genetic inheritances, a jaw size inherited from one branch of a family tree and a tooth size inherited from another, arriving together in a single face and not quite matching, exactly as the underlying arithmetic predicts they sometimes will. It is the visible surface expression of specific named genes, MSX1, PAX9, and the much wider network of more than 100 supporting genes that quietly decided, months before birth, exactly how large those front teeth would eventually grow. It is the physical trace of a 12,000-year-old shift in how the entire human species chose to eat. A jaw that adapted to softer food faster than its teeth ever did, recorded permanently in a mouth the same way a fossil is recorded in stone. And it is the very same feature that Yoruba communities call AG and treat as a mark of beauty, that other ancient societies associated with luck and fortune, and that people across the modern world continue to seek out deliberately rather than erase. The science here did not simply explain a small dental quirk. It traced that quirk backward through parents, through tens of thousands of years of shifting human jaws, into deep evolutionary time itself, and at every single step it found not a defect, but an inheritance. That gap was never something that merely happened to a person. It is something a person carries, ancient, specific, and entirely their own, a small but genuine piece of the long, layered history of the human face. Still visible, still readable, right there in a single smile. The next time a stranger, a parent, or even an old family photograph draws attention to that small space, there is now a real answer waiting behind it, one built not on guesswork or old habit theories, but on named genes, measured heritability, and 12,000 years of dietary change written directly into bone. Few features on the human body carry that much documented history in a space barely a few millimeters wide.